right, good afternoon, everyone. Happy Thursday, and thank you for joining us for this workshop session this afternoon. Thank you for your patience and participation. Without further ado, my name is Bianca Dawson. My pronouns are she and they, and I am the co-founder of Underwire Collective, a bookings and promotions company here in the oldest city in the nation, St. Augustine, Florida, and we aim to diversify live music. I'm joined here today by our diverse and esteemed panelists to discuss a very important and relevant topic today: hip hop and its role in HIV stigma, community health, and the future of advocacy. This discussion was made possible thanks to Howard University and the partnership between the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, the Southern AIDS Coalition, the Treatment Action Group, and the Black AIDS Institute. I think this is a unique topic because I don't believe a lot of people think about music and music culture as an intersectional part of community advocacy. I don't think a lot of evidence-based research has been conducted around this topic, which could also be called performance advocacy. So I'm hopeful that we explore music culture, especially in terms of hip hop, HIV stigma, and community engagement. We can bring forth more attention to this topic that will spark greater initiative for more collaborative work, research, and community engagement opportunities to develop. And of course, for all of you listening and watching, please insert your questions and thoughts in the chat as we may get to them. Today, I'm joined by our amazing diverse panelists: Timon West, he, they; Jaden Edison, he, him; and Graciela Kane, they, them. I would like to go around the room to have each of you further introduce yourself, but I'd also like to have a little icebreaker question as well. So as we go around the room, as you introduce yourself, I would also like you to answer the question: what is one song that represents your personality? For those of you listening and watching, feel free to put your response in the chat as well so we can get this discussion rolling. Timon, I'd like to start off with you.
Awesome. Timon West, he, they pronouns, and shout out to all my Howard folk. I was there during the year '93, which was a great year for hip hop, golden era hip hop, on exchange from Duke University, but I consider Howard as much of an alum base as where I went to undergrad. So really glad to see everybody. That song for me would probably be De La Soul's Me, Myself, and I. They were a trend-setting group that really celebrated and valued individuality in hip hop. And I actually went to a De La concert at Howard while I was there. It was Eric Sermon and De La. So yeah, good days, good times, and happy to be a part of this family.
Graciela?
Hi, so my name is Graciela. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. My song, oh my God, I love this song, or love this question. And the song I have to go with, I have Tribe Called Quest tattooed on my arm. I have to go with Excursions. It's giving homage, to jazz, to hip hop, and also talking about, changes can't be made if we're separate forever. And so I really, really love that song, really love that album. But just a little bit about myself. I'm a singer, I'm a rapper, DJ, community curator, supporter, peer support coordinator, and here as an advocate and as an ally for folks who are living with HIV.
You have Jaden?
Absolutely, nice to be here in front of everybody. Shout out to Howard University. Got a lot of friends from Howard. So yeah, no connection personally, but I love Howard. So thank you for having us. That's a good question. And I struggle with it a little bit, but I'm originally from Chicago, so I'm a Chicago kid. So I'm gonna go with Kanye West, Stronger. And I love that song. I love the production on that song. And that's one that, I played sports in high school, so they used to get me going pregame, like, let's go. I'm ready to run through a wall. So that's one for me. More about me. Yes, I attend Columbia University here in New York City. So I'm a journalism student. I've been a journalist, for a few years. And I guess in relation to this panel specifically is over the last several weeks, I've been reporting on the intersection of HIV and hip hop. So really diving into the history of it and obviously, what we're seeing today. I know a lot of people, I'm sure we'll talk about the baby and all that stuff. So I've really been diving into that stuff over the course of the last several weeks and whatnot. So I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, thank you all for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all. I just want to start off, just a general group question. As professional and artists, what are some concerns you've had or have had regarding music's influence on stigma and community? Jaden?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we really have to understand just the power of hip hop. I mean, especially I know everybody on this panel, just talking sort of preliminarily, is like we all have like strong roots. Like that is the thing that I use this phrase all the time. Is like hip hop for a lot of people, specifically in Black and Brown communities, has played the role of teacher and doctor. It's like whenever you're going through it, you're gonna play your favorite hip hop songs to try to get you through it. We look towards certain artists for inspiration, to their models and the moves that they're making. Like for example, I can use Jay-Z. Like seeing the moves that he's made in the business world might tell a kid growing up in the Marcy projects like I can do that. That's something that's capable and that's something that's possible for me. And so there's a lot of power with that influence. And with that being said, is like when you have artists who are misinformed, right, as a result of systemic wrongdoing, as a result of, misinformation, et cetera, that power and that influence still remains. And so I think that's what it is that oftentimes what happens is, certain people, we grow up, with being mistreated in the healthcare system. We grow up, hearing false things about ourselves, right? As far as, what are all the outlandish myths we've heard? Black people have thicker skin than, white folks, just all these outlandish things. And those same offbeat narratives are the things that we hear about our own within the hip hop community, right? Whether it be whether it consists of the LGBTQ plus community, whether it consists of women, like the misogyny in hip hop, right? So I think, that's something that I would say, to get back to the question is, that's something that's important to understand is that, the influence of, the different hip hop artists and all the positive things that it brings in terms of, change, is in terms of fighting the power and in terms of, speaking up against police brutality, whatever it might be. That same influence remains when it comes to the misogyny we see in hip hop, HIV stigmas in relation to this, discussion specifically. So I think that's just important to note, and one important thing to understand.
I would say jumping off of that, and I didn't say a whole lot about myself. I work in the education space. I lead Teach for America's National Prism Alliances, which works to ensure that students have safer and braver classrooms, particularly if they're non-binary, trans, or LGBTQ. And I think that's oftentimes we don't think about that intersection of Black. When we talk about Black people, a lot of those Black people we're talking about are part of the LGBTQ community. They're not separate communities. I'm also a hip hop artist. I was a pioneering hip hop artist in a group called DDC back in the 90s through the early O's. And that was back when no one was talking about the prospect or idea of queer hip hop artists and MCs. So we faced a lot of barriers back then with just people being in disbelief that people could be openly queer and rapping and rhyming. And now to see something like a Lil Nas X sort of make way in the hip hop space, I think is on the backs of a lot of people that were out there doing that for a long time before. What I will say about stigma also, and another important fact, is that I started the group DDC as a result of my HIV status in '99. I had just tested positive. I was given a year to live by a white physician that I don't think really was talking about, and was just terrified and afraid. And I decided then to go find a Black doctor, a Black queer doctor. I was in Oakland, California at the time. And that doctor told me, Timon, today is the sickest you will be. And here, 23 years later, I'm here to speak truth to power. I founded a hip hop group because I found two friends. We went to a piano room. I was a Stanford graduate student at the time. Where we could rent out these rooms. We got buckets, a piano, and that 1 hour sort of impromptu session that was made on cassette tapes back in the day. We recorded it with a cassette tape, became the basis for our debut album, which was called Bougie Boho Post Promo Afro Homo. You can look it up. It's a classic hip hop album that pays homage to Pomo Afro Homo, which is a queer theater and arts and spoken word collective. And we went on to do 5 or 6 albums after that. So I think all to say, when I hear these messages, I was in a documentary by Byron Hurt called Hip Hop Beyond Beats and Rhymes. And there was a woman that spoke. She said something in that film that really struck with me. And I think it speaks to what Jaden said. She said, from a perspective of a Black woman, loving hip hop is like being in a domestic violence relationship. Hip hop's my man, and he beats me, and I love it, right? And I feel the same way as a queer person who lives with HIV. That as much as I love and have contributed to hip hop, I still have to reckon and wrestle with the fact that like people will say that like being queer and being in hip hop are not, not our opposition. There's no way to do that. Somehow you're not hip hop if you're queer. Or when incidents like the thing with the baby happens, he's not just talking to a random person. That is me, my lived experience, me as a person in hip hop, that is having to reckon with someone invalidating my experience. And so I think it's important for us to remember that like, we're not just talking about hypothetical people with HIV, we're talking about people within our own communities and our own families. And that's why we need to address and really confront stigma as much as possible.
Yes, yes. And I just want to piggyback a lot of what Jaden and what Tim and were saying. I think we have to really shift that energy, for me anyways, off of our community, because where did our community get, like Jaden was saying, where did our community get this stigma from? The state, the CDC, a lot of that is what informed where we're at, where stigma is. And I think it's really unfortunate because yes, we're going to bring the baby, he's here, into the space. And it's just like, that's generations of Black folks who have been harmed by the state, who have been harmed by doctors since slavery. Slaves were performed on, slaves were told, because they were slaves, they could not feel pain, like Jaden was saying. And it's still being seen today that Black communities face so much discrimination, when, for my position coming in as someone who is a peer support person, who was doing HIV testing, who was a case manager, supporting young people going into these offices, still facing discrimination because they're trans, because they're trying to get their hormones and trying to get their medicine, but then also facing so many interlocking oppressions that come along with it. And so I think it's unfortunate, and I think it's frustrating, but I think we really have to get to the root of it. And it's not our communities, it's where it's coming from, which is the state, which is physicians, and it's ongoing.
So this kind of ties in, Graciela. So how does your current work intersect with HIV stigma in community health?
Yeah, so currently, I forgot to mention this earlier too when we were talking about bragging about ourselves, who we are. Currently, I work at BEAM, the Black Emotional Mental Health Collective, where I'm a mental health training coordinator. And then also just like someone who's in the community as a DJ, as a musician, trying to use my platform. Oh, hello, I can't. Babies and dogs gonna make me stop instantly. And I try to use my platform to talk about these things, to talk about, stigma that we see in the communities, the things that marginalized folks face every single day. And this is just I feel my duty, as a musician, and I don't feel like it needs to always be on the musicians, on those folks, because we're on the margins, we're the ones that have to uplift, and also, we're living, breathing parts of this work as well. And it's hard, it was hard for me when I was a case manager and I was in community, not only with like young people, but then also my friends as well, and seeing the effects that they had, because was not only a pandemic that was happening, but it was two pandemics that was happening. The HIV pandemic was still ongoing. And so just trying to use, what I do as a musician, as a DJ, and someone curating space within my community, to have access to HIV testing when you come to a Duval Folks party, which is my party that I was doing down in Jacksonville, Florida, making sure that they had access and knew where they could get an HIV test, where they could get an STI test, because who's going to help us if we're not helping us? And that's something that's a long lineage that we see within hip hop, that we see within LGBT culture.
I would say alongside my journey as a hip hop artist, I worked in multiple spaces as a youth director, as a youth coordinator. I remember I decided when I tested positive that I wasn't going to come out about my HIV status. This was in the late 90s. The life-saving medications were not quite tested and true. And so there was a lot of heavy stigma then. And I was working at a youth center in Oakland called SMAC Youth Center, Sexual Minority Alliance of Alameda County. Mostly Black youth, brown youth, by the hundreds would come to our center. And I was having a conversation with a group of young men about HIV. And the question came like, what would you what would you do if you found out that you tested HIV positive? And I had to reckon with the reality that like these men, one by one in a circle, went around and described different suicide methods. I would jump from the Golden Gate Bridge. I would find the nearest rope and hang myself. I'd find a gun and kill myself. And here I was, their mentor, a graduate student, having started this like queer rap group, sitting there like, okay, I just tested positive like a month ago. I hadn't even really reconciled what that meant for me. But I was like, I can't let them leave this room thinking that the only option is suicide and death if you find out that you're positive. And so in that split moment, I made a decision that I had to let them know that I had just tested positive and that I was determined to live, right? And these are kids that are a part of hip hop culture. They are a part of, some of them are out in their communities, some of them are not out in their communities. But I think, we are hypocritical if we say, Black Lives Matter and we're down for Black people and we want Black empowerment and Black unity, and we continue to marginalize and leave out segments of our population that have so much to contribute and have contributed so much historically. So I think that that's important in that work. I'd also say that those early advertisement about HIV prevention, it was often the Grim Reaper. It was often like the way that HIV was talked about was like, you get positive, you die, right? And I think so some of the narrative, another reason I came out was because we only had Magic Johnson as a point of reference for someone living with HIV. And my kids will always say, well, but he's rich. That's why he's alive, because he's rich, not because there are medications that he can take that could help him survive. And so I think they needed more tangible, in your face, people they knew, people they respected, to say, oh, that's somebody that I know. That's like my uncle or my cousin or the guy down the street or my teacher. And also as a teacher, I taught high school for 15 years. I was out to my students not only as a queer man, queer Black man, or as a queer Black basketball coach, which I was in DC, as Cesar Chavez, but as a HIV positive queer Black man. And those students who are now 30, 31, they're different with their sons. They're different with their communities because one of their icons and their heroes was a queer Black man with HIV. And so I think just the power of visibility and speaking truth to power and showing up authentically is so, so important.
Yeah, for me, it's interesting. I think journalism, it's so important today now more than ever. I mean, you see it with how things have played out with the pandemic, right? And all the different, misinformation that is spread, and, to, public officials, saying things that are just outlandish and false. And a lot of times I think about, when if you don't have journalism in this type of landscape, like the dangers, when we talk about stigma, when we talk about like real actual danger in terms of people not being able to make the right decisions for themselves, that's a scary to really think about. And so I really think back to at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, right, in the early 1980s, right, like the just like, I keep using the word outlandish because that's the only way I can really use to describe them, but like the outlandish things you hear about, you know, oh, this is a gay white man's disease. Oh, I ain't got nothing to do with that. I ain't with that. So that's not something that could even come close to what I got going on over here. Like, we good. And to then you know, you look, I think years go by, and then it gets to a point that almost half of, you know, people living with HIV are people who are Black, and the majority of it is Black and Latinx. And so you look at that, and you see how sort of journalism can play such an important role in that, in terms of, you know, the being able to question, you know, vague public health announcements, you know, being able to, you know, challenge, you know, public officials when they're saying things that are blatantly false. And for me, I've definitely felt that responsibility, you know, being, you know, originally from Chicago and then spent a lot of time growing up in Houston, just knowing my family and, you know, knowing my upbringing and my ties to hip hop culture. You know, it gives you a certain perspective as a journalist that, you know, a lot of, you know, my white colleagues, you know, might not have, because they haven't had certain lived experiences, right? They haven't seen certain things that, you know, perhaps that we have seen just by being Black, you know, or being people of color. And so I've always felt that sense of responsibility in journalism, which is something that, you know, I guess that really made me gravitate toward the intersection of HIV and hip hop, but also so many other issues too. I mean, when we talk about what is going on over the last year, with George Floyd, I mean, now you got the Ahmaud Arbery trial going on, the Kyle Rittenhouse deal that's going on. Like, it is so important now, I think, to be a Black journalist. And I don't want to say now more than ever, because historically we know what you know, what our community has experienced. But nonetheless, you know, you look at folks like, you know, Ida B. Wells, and, you know, I'm reading a book right now about the Chicago Defender, legendary, you know, newspaper, you know, out in Chicago. And I just think about, I've been listening to it today, actually, this morning. I'm like, just so how, you know, when everybody else was not meeting the moment, it was the people like, you know, Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and the Chicago Defender, et cetera, who did fill those gaps and did what they could. So, and brought truth, you know, to communities that desperately needed it when misinformation was spreading, you know, like wildfire. So I think, you know, for me, I definitely feel that, you know, now, as I continue to get older and to continue to expand my worldview, because I mean, I think about my knowledge of HIV prior to me even doing this kind of reporting, and it's like, I was poorly misinformed, right? And it wasn't even like out of a place of malice or like, oh, I'm this or that. It's like the information just wasn't there. And until I, you know, went out and sought it out, until I talked to the right people, you know, until I read the right things, right? You know, it took all that for me to I guess have the perspective that I have now. And so I see that, and I think about, well, how many other people are like that, you know, in certain communities and whatnot. And so I would say, you know, that's important to me as a not only as a journalist but a Black journalist. Is sometimes, you know, it feels in a landscape where trust in the media, you know, is at lows, and you know, this whole fake news campaign, and you see what's going on with, you know, the assault on quote unquote critical race theory, as people try to call it, like all these different things that are going on. You know, now, you know, it's really important that, you know, I feel, at least I feel this way, as, you know, Black journalists, you know, really step up and meet the moment, because if we don't, you know, others won't. I mean, you see it with folks like Nicole Hannah-Jones and, you know, Wes Lowry and Yamiche Alcindor, all these Black folks who are doing remarkable work in journalism. You know, without them doing the work that they've done, you know, so many things, people will not be able to make certain decisions for themselves that they ultimately need accurate information to make. So I would say that's that for me.
I would also like to say, you know, when you think about issues such as Black women and mortality rates for Black women who are pregnant, right? That there's, you know, that we recognize and acknowledge how the medical complex has been a very nuanced institution for people who are Black. But the same is true for HIV, right? There's a reason that I was with a white doctor who determined that I had a year to live, versus a Black doctor that told me that was the sickest I was going to be. And so we also need medical practitioners who are culturally responsive and culturally aware of who, you know, because if you don't value a person's life, you're not going to try to save it, right? So I also want to highlight that. And even in a lot of the early AIDS activism and work that was being done, the medications, there weren't clinical trials on Black men and Black women, right? Like, so some of those medications did not even work well with us, given the fact that they weren't even considering us as a population. So we have to continue to understand that the impact of HIV/AIDS has been the heaviest, on our people, and therefore drive attention and care to that as a result.
Just like to ask our panelists next, where do you think we are currently regarding music's impact on community and stigma? Graciela?
Yeah, I think that question was so hard to think about and to ponder on. But I do want to say, something that I really love that Jaden point that they made, talking about the gaps being filled. A lot historically, our communities, me coming into this space as like a queer person, LGBT folks did take on that role of making sure that we were good. You had ballroom culture where mothers and fathers were taking in young people, making sure that they knew about sex education, making sure they knew about what peer support looked like, what safe sex looked like, what HIV was, and giving those realities to those young people, because we knew that the state, that the doctors, like Timon was saying, they weren't taking care of us, so we had to take care of us. And so I think for me anyways, seeing here in the South, there's this amazing group called Southern Fried Queer that's in Atlanta, where I occupy space. You see ballroom taking up space and having, chopped HIV, having ballrooms that are centered around HIV stigma, that have access to condoms and things like that. And I think that's something that I have not seen personally in the hip hop world. I haven't seen, people having access to condoms, having HIV testing going on, but I've seen it in queer dance parties, which is still, I feel, a huge part, according to, or that is related to hip hop too. DJing is definitely, one of the elements of, hip hop, let's be real. And so we're seeing that happen like in queer spaces where they're taking on and they're giving that literacy to our people, and seeing that also with COVID when that was happening, giving those queer online dance parties, making sure our people were okay, because our people were doing mutual aid before mutual aid was even, a thing. Our people were taking care of each other before we even had that language. And so I think it's important to also highlight that there is a long lineage of us filling those gaps, of us making sure we're taking care of each other, because, we all we got at the end of the day. So.
It's interesting that Jaden mentioned Houston. Houston's another city. I've lived all over. Houston's another city where I lived and taught. And I know some of the best efforts, most effective efforts to get people tested for HIV were connected to HIV testing that was connected to hip hop. So they do like hip hop for HIV, and you'd have thousands, literally thousands of people show up to get an HIV test because they could go to the concert for free. Right. And so there have been those efforts historically where people were able to get education. But I think something that those efforts lacked was even informing the artists. So there were moments when artists got on stage and said really problematic things like, don't get HIV or you'll die. And it was like, oh, dude, like, that's not the right message. Right. So I think like we also need to inform, when I think about the baby, it's like, people don't know what they don't know. And so the compassionate part of myself is like, yeah, let's actually work on what restoration looks like in our community. What does it mean to give people exposure to conversations and people? For him to see someone like me that's like 23 years HIV positive, thriving, living my life, out there on hip hop stages, spitting my rhymes too, it really sort of reshapes that narrative. But we have to create those opportunities. And I'm certainly in agreement with Graciela that like, it's us that has to do it, right? We can't wait for other people to do it. We have everything we need in our community to heal our community, but we have to really confront some of the divisions and silos and isms within the Black community before we could get there.
Yeah, one thing I'll just tack onto that is, you know, accountability in hip hop, right? Is I think oftentimes what you see is such a large lack of accountability, right? Because even with the baby situation, you know, you have, you know, prominent artists, right, who people follow and who people listen to, you know, coming out and saying, oh, well, you know, I stand with the baby, and, you know, what he said was he was just speaking his truth, you know, all these outlandish things that you hear. And I think, you know, that's a microcosm of what we've seen, you know, hip hop at large. Is like, you know, and it's really hard to pinpoint, you know, why is it this way? But, you know, it's just unfortunate because, you know, you would think that we've seen the power of hip hop, you know, during, especially if we're gonna talk about right now, right? Like even last summer, like I think about what Lil Baby did with the song "The Bigger Picture," right? Like this is a song, one of the hottest hip hop artists, young hip hop artists, you know, out now today, especially in the South, you know, is using his platform to you know, shine a light on what's going on with police brutality, right? And it's like, if, you know, our artists just had that education I was talking to somebody about this a few weeks ago. It's like, just think about all the stuff that we talking about in hip hop with lean and drugs and sex, et cetera, et cetera. And we just twisted the message just a little bit and started talking about more sex positive things, more positive things in general, right? Like how many people we can move, right? Like I'll use this example, like just the influence of, you know, and of artists like, I'll say Beyonce. I know you're like, what does that have to do with hip hop? But I guess I'm more so trying to use an example of influence, right? Like if Beyonce comes out tomorrow and says, hey, everybody, let's start wearing FUBU again. The whole Beehive is gonna change their whole behavior, and everybody gonna be wearing FUBU again, right? Like but that's the power of the culture. And so just imagine, you know, everybody coming out like we saw in some parts in the 90s, right? People come out and they, you know, they start speaking about, using condoms, and they start speaking out against, you know, misogyny and out against homophobia, and stop trying to other people within our own community, right? Thinking of, you know, people, it's almost like people don't acknowledge that, you know, Black trans folks are a part of the Black community. I think Tim spoke to that earlier. It's just like we other our own folks, you know, all too often. And a lot of that, if, you know, the people with these major platforms who hold all this influence were educated, you know, so much more, you know, could get done. But what ends up happening is that, you know, the task to do the education ends up falling on, you know, we talk about this conference, like groups like the Black AIDS Institute and the, you know, the Southern AIDS Coalition, and, you know, artists, you know, who have certain perspectives that others don't have. And that's unfortunate because, you know, with the right information, I just think that, you know, so much more could be done. We could be so much more productive. And that's hip hop culture at large, not even just hip hop music, because I would say R&B is a part of hip hop culture. You know, dance, Graciela talked about DJ, all that, that's all hip hop. That's all our stuff. So if everybody just came together, I think so much more could be done.
Yes, I also want to, you know, piggyback of what Jaden was saying too. It's like, you know, we're talking about like if these artists were doing that, but, you know, for me coming into this space as like a queer hip hop, you know, rapper, that those conversations are happening, you know, and I think Bianca can speak to this, like going into some dive room into the middle of nowhere, and those queers are having those conversations with those crowds, you know. And if the CDC could go into there and see that there is, you know, HIV talk that's happening, there's interventions that are happening in a lot of those places, but they're not being funded. You know, they're not given that money to have those interventions in rooms. You know, for me back home in Jacksonville, you know, I did a dance party that was, you know, acting up on HIV, where we had HIV testing that was in the room, where we were talking about stigma around HIV. And, you know, that was out of my coin. That wasn't out of, you know, anything like that. And the health departments are not aware that mutual aid and that young people and that queer folks are having these conversations. They're doing these types of events without y'all. And it's like, where is that gap at? Why aren't they being funded? What, you know, we all go to the same communities, you know, and now putting my nonprofit hat on, you know, we go to the same communities, having the same events, having the same things. Like, imagine if you gave that money to hip hop folks, but then also had interventions with them where, like y'all were saying, they're not having that misinformation of like, hey, don't say this, you know, say this. Imagine if you gave that money to hip hop and what communities you actually could be touching if you were able to back them up. Because what does Beyonce have? What do those other people have? They have the capital, they have the funding, they have all those things.
Yeah, I guess Graciela, you kind of touched on my next question, but to the panel, are there currently any mobilization efforts taking place in your respective areas?
Yeah, well, I touched on it a little bit, but yeah, I just, you know, using my dance party back in Jacksonville and, you know, internationally, hopefully taking it, Duval Folks, which was the first BIPOC dance party in Northeast Florida, where we use this space to create, you know, not only a safe space, because, you know, safe spaces are hard to create, but really creating a braver space, because in Jacksonville was the epicenter for Black trans and gendered violence at the time in 2018, when I decided to create this party. And I was just noticing that there wasn't spaces. You know, we have, you know, as someone who's queer, you know, when you go to the gay clubs, and I think Bianca and Tim could speak to this, you know, there's difference between gay and there's difference between queer, you know, and we don't want to go to the gay parties. We're over it. We're done with it. It's dead. And I just was in a space where I was DJing in those gay clubs, and I felt so many microaggressions as a Black Latinx person. You know, gosh, the things that these owners would say, and the microaggressions of like, okay, you can play that song on Urban Night, and then you can play that song on Latin Night. And I'm just like, but But why, when the top 15 songs in the USA are all hip hop? Like, you know? And so that's the thing, is that queer people, LGBT folks, we're the ones that, you know, we had to create our own spaces for us, you know, to share space with each other, to have community with each other. And that's what I had to do in my city, because I just wasn't seeing it, you know, it wasn't accessible. Like, my friends don't have $15 to come see me and then pay money. Like, I'm 21, why do I have to pay a cover, you know? So, and then also on top of that, for me, I also noticed that a lot of queer folks, their first times were in, you know, not sober spaces. So I also wanted to create a sober space for LGBT folks to come and share space together. And so using, you know, Duval Folks to, you know, highlight like communities, and to highlight organizations and grassroots folks that are also doing that work. Because like I said earlier, you know, the nonprofits, you know, they don't know what mutual aid is. They don't know how to get down to the ground. They have to rely on grassroots folks. They have to rely on quote unquote advisory boards to do the work and the labor. And so that's what I wanted to do with Duval Folks, is like use that space to not only create a dance party, but to create, you know, an ecosystem of safety for Black and Latinx folks.
I think that's so critical. I'm based in Cincinnati, but I do a lot of work all over. And I know one of the things that we've been doing in our community is forging conversations across sexuality lines. So we have a group of people that come together, straight and LGBT brothers, are, you know, who have conversations about masculinity, toxic masculinity. Because I think, fortunately, I feel like now there are spaces where people are having conversations across those lines. It's something that's long overdue. And I think, fortunately, there are, you know, somebody mentioned Common, you know, Common, you know, had any number of rhymes that were anti-LGBT for a long time. And I think through his own exposure and learning has become an ally to the community. And that story is duplicated among many hip hop artists. So, but I think we also have to shine a light, not just on when somebody gets it wrong. Like, we don't talk about disposable heroes of hypocrisy. Back in the 90s, they did a song, you know, what am I gonna do if I find out I'm positive? This was in like the early 90s, when you had a Black hip hop artist out of the Bay talking about HIV in a way that was like really sensitive to that topic. So we need to elevate those positive examples, as well as holding people accountable. And the last thing I'll say is that it's really important that we don't confuse cancel culture with accountability culture, right? Everyone talks about, oh, like, you know, let's not cancel people. But I think it is important for us to hold people accountable. Accountability, in my mind, is love, right? If I don't care about you, I can let you be wrong and say some crazy stuff, and I'm gonna just let you stay ignorant, right? If I care about you, hey brother, let's talk about what you said, right? Like, you know, that had this impact, that effect. And I think if we're really focusing on love in our community and Black love means we hold people accountable.
Yeah, and mine will be a little bit, I mean, I guess my answer probably a little bit shorter just because I'm not like actively like grassroots, you know, campaigning and doing stuff like that. But I got to speak to journalism at large. It's like, you know, I just think at large we can do a better job. Again, I always speak back to meeting the moment, right, and understanding, you know, people need certain information to be able to make, you know, decisions, you know, healthy decisions, you know, within their own lives, right? So I just think about my own education growing up, right? I think I mentioned this last week, you know, talking to the panelists here. It's like, you know, before I started getting involved in journalism, right, I looked at HIV and I'm like, well, knowing all the stuff that's been going around, how is somebody like Magic Johnson still alive? Like, it ain't making sense. The money isn't what it is. And not even knowing that, you know, there is medication that you can take that pretty much undetectable, non-transmissible, all et cetera, all these different things that people within our communities just don't know. And it goes back to a point that I made earlier. It's like, it's unfortunately like it's the role of, you know, people, the journalists from those respective communities, unfortunately, that have to, you know, do that work, right? Because if we don't do it, you know, no one else will. So I just think that's important is with HIV and a plethora of other issues, is just really being able to understand that, you know, without you know, without accurate information, people cannot make healthy, informed decisions about their lives. And so that is super. I keep it super simple like that in terms of, you know, for my motivation and what keeps me driving every day, even though this is stressful and the industry isn't built for people who look like me and people who talk like me and sound like me. And, you know, you see that every day. Like, I'm a dude in a vest ain't supposed to show up in the news. You know, that's not what you think of when you think of a journalist, right? I'm supposed to have a suit and tie on. I'm me, you know? But it's just, you know, just understanding that. And yeah, I just think that's important for the journalism, right? It's continuing. Even with HIV, like, there's so much information that within this specific community in terms of advocacy, you know, it's common knowledge. But when you step outside of these walls, there's a world of folks, people I can think of off the top of my head, my family, immediate family, who don't know a clue about, you know, PrEP. They don't even, what is PrEP? I don't even know what PrEP, you know, like stuff like that, people just generally don't know. And so I would say, again, I keep repeating myself, just continue to meet the moment and continue to challenge ourselves to, when we're doing these stories too, is not to just parachute in, but to really, you know, connect with folks. Because I think oftentimes those kind of interactions are what really spark change, right? It's not telling somebody from afar, hey, you need to do this and do that, right? It's people being able to understand that, you know, you're there because you care about their well-being. And I always talk about transformational over transactional, right? I think that's what it has to be, right? And oftentimes in journalism, because of, you know, budgets, because of access, et cetera, resources, et cetera, you don't see that. And it's going to take, you know, the folks doing the shoe leather reporting to really get out there. And I think, you know, you ask Frederick Douglass, you ask Ida B. Wells, you ask some of the greatest journalists who have ever done this or even been around the media space. Journalism is a form of activism, right? And it's not the activism of, you know, maybe holding up signs and, you know, shouting at a protest, but journalism, you know, is activism for the truth and activism against the status quo, right? And if you're not doing the work that challenges, you know, what the status quo is, that disproportionately keeps Black and brown folks, you know, at a disadvantage, you know, in all respective fields, then you're not doing your job, right? And so I would say, you know, that's that for me in terms of the journalism community at large and what I'm hoping to do as I continue to progress.
I just also want to say that, yeah, journalism, I mean, not journalism, advocacy and activism isn't just like these big major events that we put on. We are all about to have really interesting conversations with people in our family with diverse opinions, right? And so oftentimes we sit at those tables and our old uncles and aunts say stuff and you just be like, and I know sometimes it's like, okay, do I want to expend my energy this way? But that's advocacy and activism too. And I want us to keep that in mind as we prepare, some of us at least, to go home and be with family, that accountability is love, right? And even if you just put out there, you know what, not everybody thinks that, or there's a different perspective that I have on that. That's a form of activism. That's a form of advocacy. And I think, you know, we don't have to have the big major events, but if each of us had conversations, we went home for Thanksgiving about these different topics, you know, we change one mind, one heart at a time. And that actually has that ripple down effect of changing our community.
Yes. And I also want to uplift you, like Jada, you're doing such important work, like coming into this space, like from academia. Like, I can't wait to read that dissertation on hip hop and HIV. Like, that is so important because there's such an erasure of that, you know, there's such an erasure of like Black men not speaking to HIV, to not speaking to like where that intersects with hip hop, you know, because they do have very similar timelines, you know? And so I think it's important to also say academia's role in stigma around HIV, because I don't think we brought that into the room yet. Let's bring them to the floor, you know? Like, academia has such a huge role in how also we have seen HIV and the stigma that has come along with it. So I just want to uplift my friend that you're doing important work, you know, alongside all of us. And it's going to take all of us, you know, to get us there.
I appreciate that. And I guess one thing I'll add too, because I keep thinking about my own journey with this. And again, like before I really got into journalism, right? Like I played sports in high school. I had always thought that before journalism, I was going to be a person. I like sports. So I'm like, I'm going to be on there like Stephen A. I want to talk about sports. And then it wasn't until I met, you know, one of my mentors today, one of my great friends. He works at MLK 50 over in Memphis, the great nonprofit doing a lot of great journalism. And just seeing like, you know, the conversations that he would have, it was so nuanced, and like his worldview was just so broad. And he was one of the, you know, people, I think, and I remember one time we were talking, he was like, yeah, like you got this and this, but you need to read more books, bro. That's literally what he's like, you need to read more books. And, you know, but it was that sort of, I say that to say is like, it was that kind of interaction to know, because I hear that from somebody, you know, casually. I'm like, who are you? Like, I don't know you, but somebody who genuinely has, you know, your best interest in mind, and people who want to see you progress. Like, that's how I think that's where the change really starts, right? It's like, because people who care about you, people who love you, like they want to see you succeed. So they're not going to sugarcoat the truth. They're going to tell you exactly how it is. And so I think that's the same approach, you know, when we talk about on a grassroots level in terms of trying to get rid of stigma, you know, in hip hop. I think I've heard so many folks in this report and talk about calling in rather than calling out in terms of how we approach people who are misinformed, right? People who with the right knowledge could, you know, who would do better if they saw better, if they knew better, right? Because I think that's the difference, right? We should make a distinction between folks who are just, even when they know the right thing, they still ignore it. Like, that's willful ignorance, and that's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about folks who are genuinely, like, you know, good people who have great intentions in mind, and with the right information, you know, we can start to see their mindset start to change and their worldview starting to broaden. I think that's where the focus really needs to be. And again, it's like, so when you hear somebody say something that's false or that's harmful, or, you know, that, you know, contributes to the stigma that we see, right? Rather than saying, you know, man, you know, you dumb, man, what are you talking about? Like, you know, it's over with. I don't even want to hear from you no more. Versus saying, hey, let me talk to you for a minute. Like, yeah, here are some things. Like, I heard you say this, and, you know, I wanted to maybe read this article, right? Or check this book out, or listen to this, watch this video, and let's talk about it. Like, I think that approach is a lot more effective. And we can talk about that. That extends to, you know, HIV stigma. That expands to how we talk about vaccines in the Black community, right? All this hesitancy for people to, you know, get vaccine, so on and so forth. Like, we try to, you know, I don't know, we other folks, you know, who don't think like those who don't share the same knowledge as we do, versus, you know, I truly believe that, you know, there was more of that calling in approach. Like, we could be a lot more productive, you know, in terms of getting rid of stigma, and not only in HIV, but so many other things at large.
That's what I'm gonna say on that.
One more thing too. We're talking about, I'm sorry, but we're talking about the baby, and I just want to mention, I don't know how many people know, but like, even with the baby situation, I mean, there were multiple advocacy organizations who met with the baby, and I talked to a couple of them for the story that I did, and all accounts say, right, you know, you have your opinions on him, his music, et cetera, but with that meeting specifically is, you know, I've heard that it was really productive, right? Like, this was a guy who was like, wait, like, I didn't know y'all were fans of my music. Like, I understand. Like, I appreciate y'all taking this opportunity to try to educate me, and, you know, so on and so forth. And I'm not the, you know, the trial or the judge on how we should think about the baby. But in terms of that specific interaction, right, that calling in versus calling out, you know, I think that's productive, and I think we can't forget about that.
All right, yeah, just to continue on with that, I want to take a question from the chat. What else can the music world do to reduce stigma and promote social justice and human rights for everybody? Timon?
I love that.
I think, you know, it's interesting, and I loved hearing Graciela talk about sort of the underground. I teach hip hop studies at Humboldt State University in the Department of Critical Race, Gender, Sexuality Studies. So I think one, academia is responding to some of these things where I get to, as a professor, talk about some of these topics. One of the things that I would say is that, like, you know, if you watch Beat Street, right, seminal hip hop film, right, you know, back when people thought hip hop was just going to be a fad that lasted for a couple of months, you know, and then you see it has grown into like one of the biggest music industries ever. I think understanding that with a lot of power becomes a lot of accountability. But I also think that sometimes our eye is only on the big people, right? Like we're only looking at a Lil Nas X when there are probably hundreds of queer, Black artists, many of them HIV positive, who are also doing messages and songs around HIV and stigma. So, and that's not to say that we shouldn't, obviously we know that the influencers are on the big stages, but how can we use those big stages to introduce other artists that are out there doing great work, right, who need that bigger platform? And I think that that's just really important. It's in terms of like how we you know, expend our resources and our money. And if we are gonna have somebody speak about, you know, HIV/AIDS, you know, have they been given an education session on what undetectable means, or PrEP, or those kind of things, so that we ensure that when they are speaking about these topics, that they've been informed. Because otherwise we make them vulnerable to messing up and getting called in, when we can actually do better on the side of just preparing them for that information.
Yes, and I love that you said that, because you know, there's just so many of them. You know, you have Mickey Blanco, who's an out trans like person who's living with HIV rapper, you know, that is doing the work, that is at conferences, that not being uplifted, and so many others. And I think it's, again, back to my earlier point, I just don't feel it's completely on the musicians. You know, I think it's on the state departments to invest in communities, because we have the Marsha P. Johnsons right there in our communities. We have the Sylvia Riveras, we have the Joseph Beams that are there, but they're not being funded, you know? Like you had Marsha P. Johnson that had STAR, that invested directly into their community. You know, they were there on the ground doing the work, but nobody was investing in them until 70 years later, when we're starting to say their names and starting to do all that, when those people are already living and breathing in our communities, but nobody is investing in them. Nobody is thinking to give them. It's like, okay, yeah, you're giving them that money, but again, like some folks don't know how to apply for a grant. They don't know what grant writing looks like. You know, they don't know that that grants exist, that their organizations, grassroots organizations can do that. Sometimes they don't want to go 501, you know, and, you know, teaching them those things. And I think it's more than like the state, like having that money and investing, but then also taking it a step further and like really, really talking to communities, getting on the ground, and like not just going into the same echo chambers of the same people that we know and the same folks that we know, because we can't, as Audre Lorde loved to say, you know, we can't just blame like, where are the people at? Like the people are there, you know, y'all just have to do the work to actually get into the community to find them, because they're there, they're doing the work.
Yeah, and one tiny thing I would just add on to that is, because we talked about meeting people where they are, and I just think about education at large, right? When we talk about from a youth standpoint, right? Like how much, I would almost bet you like most people or who are in this Zoom chat, like if you took a health class, it was probably taught by a football coach or somebody who had no kind of qualification to really speak on it, right? And I get almost guarantees, I know I can speak from my experience, that I don't even think the 3 letters HIV was even a mention in my health class that I took in middle school, right? And so I just think that's an important piece of the conversation as well. Is like a lot of times, you know, people's worldviews are shaped from youth, right? So, if we're not meeting people where they are when they're young, right, when they're still, exploring and they're still sort of forming, their beliefs and their perspectives and worldview about things, and we allow sort of, misinformation and harmful information at that to sort of to stay with them as they sort of as they grow older, then I think then you start to see a lot of the issues that we've seen now, with stigma, so on and so forth. It's like, imagine if the hip hop community, right, who we talk about hip hop artists now, and I speak on mainstream just because there are a lot of underground artists who are doing a lot of great work in this. So, but in terms of mainstream artists, right, like imagine somebody taking accountability and responsibility to a young version of the baby, right, who was young and who grew up in this certain environment and experienced these unfortunate circumstances, to say, hey, like, here are some things that you should know, right? And not even in terms of HIV, but just things at large, and how that could sort of shape, could have shaped his perspective and his worldview. So I think that's a microcosm of what we see at large, is that like our schools and we're at school, like I've been in school since I'm getting my master's now, but I've been in school my whole life up until this point. And so that's a lot of my education and the things that I've learned have come from the people around me, right? And teachers and mentors, right? So if the teachers and mentors aren't informed, and the teachers and mentors aren't qualified to be teaching, this specific thing, and the curriculum isn't a reflection of what's, accurately, happening out in the world, or, what people are actually dealing with, then we have a lot of problems. So this is such a systemic problem, right? It doesn't start with hip hop. And unfortunately, what happens is that, Black folks at large are at such a disadvantage from a systemic standpoint. And, that's no secret to us. And we know that. And what happens is that the burden is oftentimes on our shoulders to correct the wrongdoings of the institutions that sort of, put us through these, these different experiences, that we've lived through. And so it's unfortunate that, hip hop oftentimes is going to have to bear the burden of that, but it is a job that's necessary now. And I do think that it starts at reaching, young folks where they are. And we talk about education. It's not where it needs to be in schools, right? And, I think that's an important piece to it as well.
I love this thread about capital, though. I think it's really important that we acknowledge the economic influence that hip hop can have. I mean, if you look at billionaires who are Black, or millionaires who are Black, a considerable number of them are people that have ties to the hip hop industry, right? So I think that's really important. Like, how do we harness our resources, our economic resources and platforms, to build communities and spaces that are for us, by us, where the doctors are for us and by us, where our medical schools like Howard, I have a few friends that graduated from Howard Medical, right? And they're getting that education there, where they're working with our people and are responsive to our people. So I think we just need to take a more intentional, deliberate effort to ensure that even the people that are doing the care, the people on the social work side, our teachers. I work in education, and I've been told by educators that, oh, that's a public health issue. Where are all kids every day, like during the school year? They're in school.
That's it.
It's a tremendous opportunity to use our school platforms to educate our people about these issues. And so we have to stop looking at like HIV and AIDS as a public health issue. It's an education issue as well.
Yes, and I love that we're here right now. Back home in Jax, where I'm from, I worked at Jasmine, which was the LGBT center, and it was so. And I love that, Jenny, you brought in talking about teachers, because in Florida, anyways, Area 4, more specifically, if we're going to get down to the surveillance of it, Florida is mandated where they can't talk about sex education. If they talk about sex education, they have to talk about abstinence. And if they talk about sex education abstinence, they can only talk about heterosexual relationships. So it's unfortunate, because it's like, not only are the youth not getting that education, but the teachers are mandated to not talk about that. So then it's on the community partners, even though they've got a sexual health clinic in the high school where youth can get a STD test, where youth can go get an HIV test, but we can't talk about how they're having sex. Like, they simply are, and we have to like get on the necks of our politicians. We have to apply pressure to let them know that our young people, just like you was having sex, your mama was having sex, like they just are. And we need to teach them harm reduction. What does harm reduction look like? What does putting on a condom look like? You know, like we can't be scared to have those conversations with our young people because there's just nothing wrong with that. They have hormones that are raging. We can't be afraid of that because it's straight up happening, you know? And so it's why not educate those young people? You know, why not get them, you know, to where they're not coming into my HIV you know, testing room, you know, at 13, at 15, and we're, you know, giving them a positive result. You know, there had to have been something that happens way before that point, and we can't be afraid of that because it's happening, y'all. It just is.
If I could direct this question towards you, Timon, from the chat. What are your thoughts on developing a system that mirrors a record company and where advocates and artists could get a record deal, funding for their advocating in art cultivation?
Wow. I mean, that's powerful. I'm a retired hip hop artist. Well, I still make music actually, but I've kind of resolved that at best I'll go aluminum instead of platinum. Although I do have a fan base and people love my concerts and my shows. But I think about what it would have meant back in the day for someone to say, you know what, like you're out there delivering positive conscious messages, and we want to reward that, right? Hip hop can make popular whatever it wants to. Some of us have been in hip hop long enough to remember when Public Enemy and De La Soul and Poor Righteous Teachers and X-Clan were like mainstream artists, and they were all conscious hip hop artists. KRS-One, right? So I think, the industry, the money can get behind whatever they want to. If the fans, if the audience say, we want different kinds of messages, we want people to address this kind of thing, the money will follow that. So I think it's also important for the people to realize how much power they have. You don't have to like every song you hear on the radio just because it's popular, right? You can demand to hear certain things and you can seek out artists. I think one of the great things about our digital media right now, where you don't have to go to Discorama or a certain place to buy an actual CD or tape, is that you can find, like a lot of people find, I have people bootlegging my work in South Africa. Someone's like, well, do you care? I don't care. Let them bootleg all day. I'm glad I'm being played in South Africa, right? So I think we have this enormous opportunity through the internet and through our digital media for people to actually find positive messaging in hip hop. Google is our friend, do a search, HIV positive hip hop or hip hop artists or whatever. But I think, yeah, to your point and that capitalism point, how do we harness the economic resources to really reward those artists so that they can sustain a career in hip hop?
This question for our panel, we've kind of touched base about it, but what perceptions about HIV need to change?
Yeah, I can start with that. I mean, first and foremost, like you can look at what the baby said on that stage, and first of all, it was so random. I always tell when we talk about that, it was just so random. First and foremost, like it's like it was like, where did that even come from? But again, I think that what he said, that's a microcosm of what a lot of people still believe at large. Like people still think of HIV as a death sentence, right? It's we got to stay away from that. That's not something that I even want to remotely be around. It's so much stigma around it, and so I think, but again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier with accountability. And this was a unique situation, with the baby, is that when he did make those comments, we saw the power of what, people speaking out and saying, hey, that's not right, and what that can do. I mean, he lost a lot. It's nothing like getting to somebody when you start tapping into their pockets, right? But he lost a lot of money. Even artists across, other genres and other cultures, came out and spoke out against him. And he lost out on even people within hip hop culture, right, spoke up. And unfortunately, you did have folks who stood right by his side, during that time, in terms of not holding him accountable, which is unfortunate. But I think at large, right, that accountability angle is just so important. Like these artists have so much influence, not only to the people who are buying their music, but also amongst one another, right? It's like, the young artists look up to a Jay-Z. They look up to, I'm just trying to think of the OJ, they look up to a Snoop Dogg. and all these other just the people who have a lot of influence in hip hop. And so if there was more policing one another within the industry too, I think we get a lot further. So I just say that is, again, even prior, I keep mentioning it, but even with my own experiences, like I think about what I knew and what I didn't know. I too thought, living with HIV was a death sentence. I've even heard from somebody who was diagnosed in 2014, or they've been living with HIV since 2014, and having that conversation, they thought the exact same thing too. We were talking about the baby situation, and he was like, it's wild because I literally thought that too until I started living with HIV, then things changed. And so it's something that's widespread and it's something that we have to address. But I'd say that that's a big, maybe that's a starting point, right? It's like, this is something that there are people who have lived decades with HIV, healthy lives. There's no difference between, like they're fine. They can still be sexually active with their partner and not have to worry about, their partner, contracting HIV, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I would say that's a starting point at least.
Yes, you said so much of what I wanted to say too. It's like, there's so much, I think it's first, like, sorry, that's my dog. I think it's just talking about sex in general, like having actual sex education, talking about STIs, talking about HIV, talking about how body parts work, and how gender plays a role in that, taking binary out of it, not just talking about men, women, talking about intersex folks, trans folks, non-binary folks, and how HIV does that, and the erasure also of trans folks in HIV as well, specifically trans men, and I think it's letting folks know that, we can have these conversations, they can be productive. People need to be funded for this work. And I know that these health departments have that money, and you have people in these communities that want to have these conversations as well. And so I think it's just more communication that needs to happen, and I think, we were talking about it too. The beautiful thing that came out of, what the baby and, that situation was, education happened out of it. We had flyers coming up about, hey, this is what HIV is. This is what AIDS is. This is what sex education looks like with HIV. Yes, folks living with HIV are having sex. They're having babies. They're having partners. They're you equals you. We're having those conversations, and so I think that is the beautiful thing that can come out of situations that happen like this when we have to collect our sister, the baby, is, education can come out of it.
I think another important thing is that, we have to hold not just hip hop accountable, right? Like oftentimes we hear hip hop, but there are conversations we need to have about the Black church, right? And the messaging in the Black church and all the Black people that died because they were cast out and told that, it was something happening to them because it was a curse or it was from God's punishment. And we have to do some calling in of those institutions as well, and the messaging in those institutions, because there are still people dying, right? It's not, even though we have, and people who are dying where it could be preventable, because they are so terrified to tell their pastor or their congregation or their family that they're living with HIV, that they would rather struggle in silence and die. And so I don't want people to have this misnomer. Just when I say that I'm thriving and doing aluminum hip hop albums 23 years later, that's not everyone's story. There are still people suffering. The impact of COVID and the cofactor of COVID and HIV was a real thing. I lost many friends during the pandemic that we're still in. So we have to continue to talk about this with a certain urgency and not pretend that like it's not an urgent issue anymore, because it still is.
And access as well. It's so important, right? People, we talk about, medication and things like that. There are a lot of folks, from, various communities who, don't have access, right, to not only education, but to, proper health care, that. So I think that's another aspect of it too. But to Tim's point, I think the church, I think that's a great point at large. So I'd agree with that.
All right, as we are coming to a close here, I just want to ask all the panelists one last question. What is the opportunity for this generation of leaders to push the needle regarding HIV advocacy?
I'll go ahead and jump in on this. I love this question so much. I think it's just knowing that y'all don't have to be afraid. I mean, I think it's just being unapologetic, unapologetically Black, queer, trans, stepping up, having those conversations. You have the mic in your hand, and speak to it, speak truth to your power, And I think that's just the most important thing, is that we do have a responsibility. It's not all on us, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of what we were saying is that we are the ones, that have us, and we're the ones that we've been waiting for. And you have so many folks that are actually doing this work and stepping to it. And I think it's just going to take all of us so that we can, see the end of this, so that we can see liberation and we can see freedom in our lifetime. I believe that we're going to see it in our lifetime, but I'm an optimist. So, and yeah, I just want to see more hip hoppers, like, moving in spaces with movement folks, moving in spaces with people. I was working at the LGBT Center. I was, doing HIV testing, and I was a hip hopper, and I was a DJ. And there's so many of us that are doing that work too, that are right in the community. So I encourage folks that are here, that are, in the medical field, go out into the community, go find, rappers, go find DJs that to give your money to. Stop giving it to the same community partners that you give it to, give it to, the drag queens, give it to those folks that are doing that work, because those are the people we need to bring in. The baby is just a part of, community. You're saying that was so random. Like, we know as Black people, we be sitting around just saying all kinds of crazy stuff, like in our barbershops, like at dinner, like you were saying. And how powerful it could be if you gave that money to folks so that we can bring those people. As much as the baby, gets on my last nerve, I still feel like he has value, and I want to see him in freedom. I want my brother to have that conversation, maybe multiple. We've only talked about this incident with the baby, but we've seen there's a lot that's been happening, but we're not gonna go there. There's so much that needs to happen. But I think it's understanding that, we need to all be there, and it's going to take all of us collectively.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Tim. You can go ahead. Oh. No, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. And I think just continue to understand that, this has been a long battle at large, with so many, different issues that have, come our way. When I say us, I'm predominantly speaking about, the hip hop culture, hip hop community, right? And again, to what we've been talking about this whole time, I just think it's important for us to continue to call one another in, right? And when it's kind of like, your family member, right? Like sometimes, there are things that we hear from our parents, our siblings, cousins, whatever it might be, that we know isn't right. And I think, it's important to understand that, we're all, we all have different things that have shaped our worldviews and things that have shaped the way we're thinking. But it's upon us, right, to be able to call one another in, right, when we hear something that's a little bit offbeat, or we hear something that we know, is harmful, right? Like, hey, like, try this, or and explaining why, something is the way it is, versus, the approach of, shouting at someone, or screaming at them and telling them why they're so dumb and they're so wrong. It's like, you don't know what you don't know. And I think, oftentimes I just think about it in journalism, right? Because journalism is a field where it's a little bit frustrating, right? Because there are so many things that are going on in the world, and so many things that you couldn't possibly have the time to learn every aspect of everything, right? Like, you might be, covering criminal justice, and then, you have an editor that throws you on, a certain beat, and you got to go gather all the information you can, to learn. And so I say that to say is, like, oftentimes you don't know what you don't know. And this entire journey, like, you never stop learning, right? I talked about this being my last year of school, but to be honest, right, like, I think, the education never really stops, right? Like, there's always going to be more to learn. There's always going to be things that we can do better, whether it be language that we use, whether it be, the way we, think about things, whether it be how we approach folks. Nobody's perfect, right? And it's an ongoing journey. And so I think, with that empathy and understanding that, we can continue to do, a lot of great work. So, and I truly believe that because I know it from personal experience, right? It's like, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, with the right person, you know, who has your best interest in mind, and oftentimes what's going to happen is that people within, you know, the hip hop community, you know, we're going to have to uplift one another, right? Even when our days are, when the days are the toughest, you know, oftentimes it's been hip hop, you know, that's also stood in, right? Because we talked about all the things that hip hop is responsible for, or I guess at least hip hop contributes to in terms of stigma, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a lot of great things that hip hop, you know, does today, right? Which we can't, you know, lose sight of. And so it's, you know, channeling some of those things and also putting it in other areas too. So it's never perfect, but my thing would just be to continue to call in one another, continue to push forward. Nobody's perfect, and we got to continue to do what we can to uplift one another. And for the folks who are willfully ignorant, who don't even want to have to take part in that, I'm not talking about those folks, right? It's like there's some people who you're not going to be able to reach everybody, and that's okay, right? It's like, but that don't stop you from doing what you got to do and handling your business. So that's what I'd say.
Yes, it's all been said. I just say don't forget the OGs. I turned 50 next year. When I tested positive at 26, I didn't think I'd make it to 30, right? So I think we have real opportunities. We have a generation of people that have been alive living with HIV for 10, 20, 30 years, right? How can we show and demonstrate that like people can have full lives, right? With the people that are here and that are connected to hip hop, right? So there's some real opportunities there, and it's just been a pleasure to be on this panel with Jaden and Graciela and Bianca.
Thank y'all so much. It's been a pleasure. Learn so much just from listening to y'all, and a lot of stuff that I can apply even after this. So appreciate it.
Ashe, yes, thank you. It's been such an honor.
Yes, thank you all. As we get ready to close out, I'd just like to thank our esteemed panel again for your time and expertise. I'd also like to thank Howard University, the HIV vaccine trials, the Southern AIDS Coalition, Treatment Action Group, and the Black AIDS Institute for your collaboration in your efforts of making this webinar take place. And of course, to all of our listeners and watchers, I thank you for your time and engagement as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of this amazing conference. It truly has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you.
Yes, moderator, let's go.
All right. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.